Hi, everybody. It's great to be part of this conference and particularly this panel on Don't Slow Me Down, which the aim of which is to discuss the controversies, the tensions, and the transitions that we face amid a changing climate. And that's precisely what I'm going to focus on today in these short 10 minutes. By way of introduction, I'm based at the University of Oxford, and my work is on transitions and tensions amid a changing climate. So there's a nice synergy here. Now, I'm going to begin with a graph that many of us have seen, and we see it so often that, in a sense, we're almost untouched by it. But this is a reminder about why we're all here. And if we look back at the concentration of carbon dioxide over the last 400,000 years, you see that there's a cyclical process of going up and down, but never has this been as high as it has been in the last 1,000 years. And so if we focus in on the box within this graph, we see that over the last 1,000 years, the rise in atmospheric carbon dioxide has risen so dramatically. And as of the end of March, earlier, a few weeks ago, the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was 416, more than 416 parts per million. And the reason why this is important is that carbon dioxide sits in the atmosphere. It lives there for many hundreds of years, and it sits there and it warms the atmosphere continuously. And the repercussions of that are indeed enormous for a warming climate. Now, given that, that's the sort of larger scientific atmospheric context that we're operating in, there are multiple challenges and tensions around trying to solve the climate problem. And what I'm going to do is focus on two of these, because to me, these are two big unresolved tensions within the climate debate. These are two questions that we grapple with often, and often that grappling does slow us down, but we don't really have a way through. And what I'd like to do is pose these two questions, and then hopefully the debate and the conversation will open them up further. Now, the first of these questions is who is responsible for the warming climate that we have today, for the levels of carbon dioxide that we see in the atmosphere today. This graph here shows us the largest annual emitters of carbon dioxide over the last since the Industrial Revolution or so. And you see that over here, if we looked at the amount of emissions that any country emitted in a single year, there are some sort of real disparities in the numbers and the figures. And you have China come out way on top with annual carbon dioxide emissions of over 10 billion tons. The United States then there's a big drop from the first, but yet much ahead of the others. Around 5 billion tons of annual emissions. And then you have countries like the EU, like India, Russia, South Africa, Brazil. You can see where the United Kingdom sits. And it is potentially one way to answer the responsibility question by saying, let's look at in the sort of, last 5 years or last 10 years, at which country has emitted the most amount of emissions. However, there is one more way to think about responsibility, and that is to look at cumulative emitters. Now, what this graph tells us is what is the cumulative amount of emissions that a country has put into the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution or so. And again, the reason why this is important is that, as we discussed, carbon dioxide sits in the atmosphere. So in a way, it's agnostic to when in time it was put in there. What matters is that it is now a part of the atmospheric composition and is continuing to warm. And if we look at responsibility in this way, we see a very different story. We actually see the United States come out on top, followed by the EU. China is much lower than it is in the previous graph. And then we have countries like Russia, the United Kingdom, India, and Brazil. Now, there is yet one third way to think about responsibility, and that is if we looked at emissions per person. Now, this view of responsibility looks not at emissions at an aggregate level in terms of country, but looks at emissions in terms of the emissions per person. So it matters whether a country is populous or not, because the argument is that it really is about what that carbon dioxide is doing to individual life, and what is the sort of quality of life or the services that it's providing to individuals. And if we look at emissions per person and responsibility in that way, you see the United States come out much higher than any other country. We see Japan rise into this graph in a way that wasn't present in the previous two graphs. And we see here that China is actually not as high as it was in the previous two graphs. And countries like India are actually much lower even than the global average, in spite of being high emitters on an annual basis. Now, this sort of framing of responsibility and a way to get through these different dimensions and views of it hasn't been easy to reconcile. And it's not clear that there is an easy answer to this question even now. In some sense, the Paris Agreement has sidestepped this issue. But for the most part, we have different versions of who is responsible still on the table without a sort of a way through. So I will move to now the second tension within our climate debates. But I hope this one shows us that this sort of unresolved piece of discerning responsibility still is very much at the at the core of how we think through our climate debates, and isn't something that there is consensus on in terms of the community. Now, the second tension, which again is one that can slow us down, is it about climate change or is it about development? Now, this question is much more pertinent in the developing world. And the reason for that is that, radical reductions in fossil fuel emissions are required to stabilize the climate. We're all familiar with that. There is no choice but to reduce fossil fuel emissions, most likely to zero. But at the same time, the reason we need fossil fuel emissions is that energy use is rising. And that energy use is needed because it provides development, it provides quality of life, it provides energy security, all of these things that underpin modern life, which individuals and societies all over aspire for and work towards. And therefore, it isn't an easy trade-off in any which way to radically reduce these fossil fuel emissions when they come at the cost of development. And many countries and societies make this point that climate change or development, when juxtaposed against each other, pose a very difficult set of questions, a difficult set of synergies, and a difficult set of trade-offs. Now, if we think about the world population, we know that in 2014, more than 3 billion people had no access to clean cooking fuels. That's about a half of the world's population, which is an enormous amount of people. It is really with the use of energy mainly driven by fossil fuels that in 2018, for the first time, the global population without access to electricity fell below 1 billion. And that wonderful development from a sort of services, aspirations, a quality of life, a developmental point of view did come at the cost of the environment. And really how we're thinking about our future then is one where we need more energy, but with fewer emissions. And that is the kind of discourse that is framing our future. That is the kind of future that we need to move towards. But the uncertainties posed by that future remain enormous, particularly around the pace, the scale, and the scope of the multiple and the simultaneous transitions that are going on in many parts of the world, and particularly the developing world. Now, I'll talk about that a little bit more in terms of the opportunities that we have when we talk about these energy demand transitions. And what we know is that if we think about the opportunities that come from urban development itself, the building infrastructure for fast-growing cities in developing worlds is going to release more than 4 times the amount of carbon dioxide that was used to build existing developed world infrastructure. And that's a big shift. It's a big step up in the amount of emissions that future growth in the developing world is going to lead to. At the same time, that development is necessary. It's necessary for quality of life and for people. And it isn't in any way an easy or an ethically sort of, manageable question to say whether that development should or should not come at the cost of climate. Now, the way through here, which is helpful in some sense, is to think about, are there ways in which we can reconcile climate and development? And one way in which we can do that is through energy demand transitions. What we know is that approximately 2/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions are connected to households, and that's households where you and I live. And that's a large number then of emissions that are connected to individual choices that we can make, particularly around mobility, residential questions, so our homes and the food that we eat. And each of these actually contribute to about 20% of global lifestyle emissions. Now, the developing world actually offers a really wonderful and unique opportunity because it is being built for the first time. It allows us with opportunities for structural transitions to lock in energy consumption patterns. So how we build this infrastructure that is going to be built in the next 20 to 30 years can be essential in locking in a particular kind of behavior, a particular kind of institution, and a particular kind of built environment that actually compromises it doesn't compromise the trade-off between climate and development, but rather focuses on the synergies between climate and development. So, for instance, having more public transportation, using energy efficiency of the built environment, using energy efficiency of homes and appliances. These are all ways in which we can use the energy demand transitions to appease this tension between climate and development. So I will leave you with these two challenges that can slow us down, but I will end with a note of hope, and that is to say that how do we overcome these controversies with socio-technical tipping points? How do we move from being stuck often in our debates and in the way that we live and organize our worlds to shifting very quickly and to doing things differently? And this is an example of New York City and Easter Day Parade on Fifth Avenue in 1900. And you see that the main mode of transportation here was horses. And then if we look at that same street 13 years later, that the main mode of transportation is cars. And to me, this is really a wonderful example of how societies and all of us have been able to make these transitions, make these tipping points, move our systems of society and technology in the ways that they interact to be able to move towards a future that we would like. And so with that, I will end, and I look forward to the conversation.